I am Sadiat Adetoro Salau, and I will be presenting on behalf of my co-author and I. Good morning once again. I bring you greetings from Nigeria, and I would like to say thank you to the keynote speakers for their very powerful presentation that I would say has set the stage for the findings of our research on citizen science or citizen silence, navigating ownership in knowledge production from Global South, to be presented by Danjuma Saidu from Federal University, Lokoja, Nigeria, and my humble self, Sadiat Adetoro Salau, from the Federal University of Technology, Minna, Nigeria. The context between the Global North and Global South in defining, accessing, and owning knowledge remains a central tension in global scholarship. I think we've heard a lot about that in the keynote address. So let's look at what citizen science is from our perspective. It's defined contextually as the active participation of the public. Now, the public includes communities and specifically non-professional researchers, because when we talk about research, we are always aligning it to expertise, like we have heard earlier, the professors, the doctors. But now citizen science includes non-professional researchers in the creation, knowledge, analysis, and dissemination of knowledge. Okay, so, and why citizen science important? Because it's seen as a democratizing force that is capable of bringing divides between the expert-driven research and community-rooted knowledge. There's been a lot of discussion about aligning town and gown and a lot of indigenous knowledge, but it's not captured by the expert researcher. So citizen science is the bridge between those two. And also it reclaims science as a collective public good, because communities can co-create, access, and own knowledge that shapes their lives. And this enables openness, equity, with particular emphasis on equity, especially for us in this part of the world, and shared responsibility in research. This is what ideally citizen science is supposed to be. However, while these initiatives are expanding globally, evidence have shown that in the Global South, and for the purpose of this presentation, Global South means Africa, they continue to operate under conditions where infrastructure, data validation systems, and governance and ownership norms are shaped and defined by the Global North. This reality risks silencing local contributions, even in participatory framework. So it's like we're all in the room, yet we're not in the room. It's giving a semblance of we're participating, we're recognizing indigenous research, indigenous citizen, yet we're not there. So this study synthesized findings from existing literature, policy reviews, and selected initiatives to explore how citizen science initiatives in Nigeria empowers local communities or reinforces epistemic dependency on the Global North. And with three objectives, the study investigated how citizen science projects in Nigeria are initiated, managed, and owned, particularly in relation to Global North influences. They examined the extent of community control and recognition in the knowledge produced through citizen science in Nigeria. And thirdly, proposed suggestions for strengthening local ownership and ensuring equitable collaboration in citizen science initiatives. The following methodology, this methodology was adopted. There was literature and policy review. The literature was reviewed on citizen science, epistemic justice, and ownership in knowledge production based on the objectives of the study. And the study also examined selected citizen science initiatives in Nigeria. We're presenting some preliminary findings from the study. And of course, the data was analyzed thematically. Now let's look at the findings from our study. Citizen science projects in Nigeria are largely driven by northern institutions or donor agencies. And what has this led to? limited local agency in setting research agendas. Research agendas must align with the goals of the funders, even if they do not contextually align with what are real problems. So for example, large biodiversity monitoring efforts in Cross River State. Cross River State is one of the states in Nigeria, one of the 36 states, often involve communities like the Boke and Ikuri community. But these projects are usually designed and controlled by organizations from the global north. So the keynote speakers talked about us not even having protocols. They are bringing the funding. And even if they are involving the indigenous community, they are deciding what the protocols of these projects are. And as a result, the community's stake is rarely retained locally. Also, communities contribute raw data, but lack decision-making power in how findings are used, published, or disseminated, which suggests trends of epistemic injustice. So, for instance, in the Niger Delta fishing community, which is also a region in Nigeria, local fishers, they share observations about declining fishing stock, water pollution, and seasonal changes with research teams. While their data is collected and published in academic journals or reports, the fishers themselves are rarely acknowledged or involved in deciding how these findings are presented or how they can be applied to address local challenges. Another finding is that although there's a gradual increase in citizen science initiatives funded by the Global South too, but the traction is now, okay, the helicopter research team, and okay, this point that the communities are not very involved. We saw a gradual increase in community-led initiatives now, even though the funders are the global north. But yet, it is still unclear how data is collected because we do not have our own protocols or principles or directives on how to go about this. So it seems like the community is collecting the data. Yes, they are analyzing the data, but where does this data go to, right? Who keeps it? Who owns it? Is it with us? Do they have the final say on all of this data, especially because the funders are from the global north? So, however, an interesting finding was that despite marginalization that we have reported in the earlier findings, there are still some Nigerian communities that preserve indigenous knowledge systems that demonstrate what we call strong potential for integration into social science. That is, if ownership rights are respected and protected, and I'll tell you why. So the example is for the tea farmers in Benue State, another state in Nigeria, that rely on indigenous weather forecasting methods, such as observing birds migration and wind patterns for planting decisions. And interestingly, their form of documentation is just oral dissemination. So what happens if someone comes and documents this and presents this as theirs? How do we retain ownership of this? These are our suggestions based on this finding, that the Global South must come up. And I think the keynote speakers emphasized that, and we are also corroborating that point, that we must come up with clear protocols, guidelines, and principles for actors in citizen science initiatives. This will ensure communities generate and retain ownership of findable, reusable, interpretable data. This is important because these communities also have their form of generating their own data, like we found out in the findings. What the knowledge generated, is it findable? Is it reusable? Is it interpretable? As Dr. Nkem said yesterday, it's not about that. It's who picks up this data and documents that owns it at the end of the day. So we must ensure that our protocols help retain ownership of findable, reusable, and interpretable data, as well as recognition in authorship, intellectual property rights, and decision-making. Citizen science projects from the Global South should also be locally led, with northern partners just playing supportive rather than directive role. We saw a bit, though there's a gradual increase, but there's still need to have more, especially if we now have our protocols. It would be better structured. There's also a need for partnerships for citizen science initiatives. Now, partnership includes local partners. Now, instead of the sole financial reliance model that we have on the global north, this determines a lot of the issues that we're having in citizen science research. That reliance, if the funding, who sent brings the fund, detects what happens. So also research policies from the global south should mandate inclusive frameworks for citizen science that respect local priorities, moving away from the extractive model of collaboration. And of course, investments in training, infrastructure, and digital tools for documentation by local researchers and community. This will ensure knowledge ownership remains where it's generated. This is very important with regards to the findings of our tea farmers. So in conclusion, the debate whether citizen science in global south actually empowers local community or reinforces their silence is still unsettled because of some of our findings. This study situated Nigeria within the wider global south and global north divide and brought to light the need to challenge entrenched hierarchies in knowledge production, even in citizen science research. It calls for models that emphasizes indigenous epistemologies, local expertise, and shared authority, because without such ownership, citizen science risks becoming an avenue, another one for citizen silence. And I'll leave us with this adapted African proverb that says that until the lion learns how to tell his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. These are our references, and I want to say thank you for listening.